Hello there. Welcome to today's video. Don't worry about who I am. You'll learn soon enough. I don't remember much of how I got back up to my house. The clouds above broke with the force of a monsoon, though the dense tree cover afforded some shelter. A good amount of it filtered through, and soon I was drenched. I couldn't care less. Visions of my dog were burned into my retinas, his broken body, his gentle eyes, and that thumping tail, and the nest of pale purple innards going taut and yanking my dog away. And now the ball. Wanna play? It was a taunt, visceral and foreboding. Choking back a sob, I gathered the ball in my arms and began scrambling back up the embankment. Somewhere in my mind, the sensible part of my conscience screamed bloody murder at me to get out of there. Whatever had done that to my dog was ravenous, predatory, and ruthless. I could do nothing against it now. I was nothing but a weary kid who saw something no one should have to see. For once I listened to the logical part of my mind and got out of there like a bat out of hell. As I scrambled up the embankment, sobbing and shuddering, I heard a sound I will never forget. The squish of teeth scissoring through flesh and the final whimpers of our beloved pet. I was pallid by the time I broke free of the thick ivy. My black hair was a mop of tangles and mud, braided with twigs, leaves, and crusted blood. The ball was clutched under one arm. I had planned to show it to my parents as proof of the monster that had ripped our dog apart, but the rain and my jacket had smeared it. I tossed it aside as I dashed into our garage, shouting for my parents. It was 6:30 in the morning, around the time my parents usually got up. My dad, bleary-eyed and dressed in a bathrobe, was the first to hear me. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee and ended up drenching himself with it. His curses joined my cries as my mom pounded down the stairs. She was probably fixing herself up for another day of moving boxes, but now she charged into the kitchen, looking half prepared and half asleep. When she saw my father clutching a burned hand and me huddled on a kitchen chair sobbing, she almost laughed. Perhaps she thought something funny had happened, that I'd scared my dad when he was getting coffee by accident, and how we were both reacting to a loud, uncertain situation. She was half right. My mom is a wonderful woman, average height, shoulder-length brown hair, bright blue eyes, and always patient. When she realized the true gravity of the situation, namely by looking at the raw fear spread over my face, she kicked into high gear. As I lay slumped over in the dining table, she crossed the kitchen and dug out an ice packet for my father. Then she sat him at the sink, turned the faucet on a high blast, and told him to hold it there no matter how much of a mess it made. My father complied with a stream of gentle curses. Then she turned to me. I felt her arms slip around my sides and picked me up against her. "What's wrong, sweetie?" she said softly. Dyson, I saw something terrible. Dyson down the hill, dead, bleeding, monster, ate him, Ivy." The words wouldn't come out in cohesive sentences. Instead, they were a torrent of abstract sounds pieced together in a way that made my mom look at my dad with a "he's in shock" expression. "Sweetheart, we know you miss him, but he's only been gone a day. You had a nightmare." My mom stroked my hair, picking out the twigs and leaves. "Were you searching for him?" I nodded and shuddered, my thin shoulders shivering under my jacket. She seemed to realize my clothes were soaked through and added delirium to her list of reasons for my bumbling. She slid my coat off, then my shirt, and wrapped a towel around me. All the while my dad watched from the sink, a thoughtful look on his face. His hand, which had minor reddening and 1 or 2 blisters, was already looking better. He flexed his hand as he looked at me. I don't think that's shock, Karen. I've never seen him like this before. My mom nodded thoughtfully. Well, let's make sure both of you are alright before we jump to conclusions. She moved over to the refrigerator and began rummaging through our meager rations for breakfast stuff. My mom always did that, filling in uncertainties with something comforting. In this case, it was blueberry pancakes and orange juice. She sent me upstairs to get changed and bandaged my dad's hand in gauze in the time it took for our first pair of pancakes to toast. As I got changed, my heart rate decreased enough to feel somewhat normal, but the visceral images of my poor dog lingered. The memories were sharp as ever, yet mercifully surreal to a certain extent. I peered down into the green abyss for a moment, envisioning all the things that it could hide. What could have done something like this to a family pet, let alone a large one? And the ball. The most unnerving aspect of it all. Whatever tore Dyson apart could write, and it was sadistic enough to taunt a child. Wanna play? I shook my head and headed back down to the kitchen where I at least had company. My mom gave me a sympathetic look as I eased myself onto the table. Outside, the rain poured down with a vengeance, turning the world into an expanse of muted greens and silvers. I dug into the pancakes while my parents talked to one another in hushed tones. Words like disturbed, exhausted, young, shock, and frozen trickled through my mind, but it didn't bother me. I was only 10. I had seen something gut-wrenching to the point where even I questioned its existence. And adults had a way of rationalizing the words of a kid to the point where they could be easily discounted. I knew what I said was difficult to believe, but at the very least, my father vouchsafed for my explanation with a second look. He wanted me to show him where I had seen Dyson. I gulped down a piece of a pancake and reluctantly agreed. We waited for the rain to subside, and in that time I managed to convince my father to bring a gun in case there really was some sort of rabid animal. As a hunter, he was pragmatic enough to entertain the possibility of some sort of predator inhabiting the ravines. My mom spent the time busying herself with the dishes and then continued on projects around the house. There's something I noticed early on about my parents. My mom took difficult news like it was a chore, because that way she could turn it into something useful. My dad was different. He's big, lengthy guy who took difficult news in a somber way and mulled it over in his mind until he came to terms with it. When I fled up that hill and ran into the house, choking on my own sobs, there'd been a brief moment where he read the sheer panic on my face. He was thinking about what could scare a kid that bad. Only that pot of coffee burning his hand kept him from digging any further. Now, he flexed his burned hand and loaded a .401 pistol, outfitted with shotgun slugs. It was meant for a deterrent for larger game that might charge at us in the woods, but I wasn't sure if anything could stop whatever could tear a full-grown lab open and drag him back with a ferocity I'd seen. And that ball, it flashed endlessly in my head as my dad slid 5 shells home. The ball rolled forward from the ivy. The reddish-brown words burned into my retinas. Wanna play?
Wanna play? Wanna play?
Wanna play?
My dad chambered the final round and slid the cylinder home. Ready, bud? He gave me a small grin. There was stubble on his face and rings under his eyes. Yeah, I said reluctantly, a shudder catching from my chest. I almost told him about the ball, but remembered it was blood-free now. If I mentioned it, my dad would probably just leave me behind. Together we went into the garage and donned our boots, all-weather pants, jackets, and fluorescent vests. As we prepped, my dad looked out into the trees with a newfound interest. You know, it's funny, he said, slipping the pistol into his holster. I don't think I've ever seen thicker vegetation in my life. Working through that stuff yesterday, great workout. He patted his vested stomach. Guess we can work off those pancakes your mom made. Yeah, I said again. I could tell he was trying to keep things light-hearted, but that just made things worse. I just want him back. My dad nodded as we crossed the driveway and stopped at the edge of the rain-slicked ivy. In the overcast, it looked black as oil, gross and slimy to the touch. "We'll find him," he assured me. "I promise." Yeah, I thought. That was the terrifying part. Together, we descended into the deep green void. Much like my previous trip, the going was slow and the vegetation ominous. Everything below the 60-foot mark was plunged into a perpetual twilight, illuminated by a hollow yellow light beneath the initial canopy of broadleafs, ivy-clad giants, and stunted black trees reigned supreme. Our footing was constantly tested by the tangles of vines and little green leaves so dark they looked black. In spite of my father's company and that pistol hanging from his hip, I couldn't shake the feeling that every moment we spent there was perilous. We didn't belong in places like this. We only visited it, hunted the creatures that inhabited it, and left before we realized we were out of our depth. I began to imagine this was another hunt for something other than whatever we are currently looking for. To make matters worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. From some vantage point in this twisted, hidden world of ivy-choked vegetation, an entity watched us. I wondered if it had watched Dyson too, perhaps curious as to why the dog would return to its domain, or why I would either, for that matter, after the horrendous things I'd seen. I found the tunnel entrance with relative ease this time, around 10-foot openings smothered in cascades of rugged greenery. I began trembling as visions of my slaughtered dog returned. My dad had to take my hand and gently guide me around the edge of the sewer. He left his gun holstered, but unhooked the strap around its grip, which made me feel a little better. We knelt at the entrance of the tunnel, quiet as sin. A foul odor breathed through the vined entrance, causing me to choke. Rotting meat. My dad plugged his nose too, but he only laughed. "Woo, that sewage is nasty. Hope you didn't flush anything toxic down here in the past hour." My vision swam. Smell was sickening to me, not laughably disgusting. It reeked of decay and malcontent, like the corpse of an animal struck on the highway. My dad thought it was just a backdraft of sewage, the type of stench you plugged your nose at and looked for someone jokingly to pin it on. "Dad, it's not sewage. It's Dyson. Remember what I said?" He tugged at the bandages on his sore hand and wiped the sweat off his brow. Like me, he had thick black hair, streaked faintly with gray. Made him look older now as a hint of sadness weighed down in his efforts to remain humorous. "I know, son. I know what you told me. Why would he go in there? Why would anything live in there? It'd screw up their scent pattern and—" "Just look in there, Dad." I was panicking. If he didn't believe me enough to at least look, then I was on my own. My dad sighed and nodded. "All right. Step back for me then." Took out his gun in case there really was some animal lying in wait. Perhaps a rabid coyote or cougar holed itself up in there. I stepped back and waited as my father softly drew the vines back. He flicked on a flashlight in his other hand and rolled its beam all over the entrance to the sewer. I craned my neck, expecting to see some terrible black beast looking back, but there was nothing. His beam reached 50 feet back, illuminating more of the same cruddy, rusted-out corridor. Some limp plants hung from either side of the wall, and a faint line of scummy water filled the bottom. Aside from the dinginess of the place, it was remarkably extraordinary. No blood, no guts, no fur or skin or bits of bone. My dog was gone, devoured or taken somewhere else. "Well, it's certainly creepy," my dad laughed, trying once more to lighten up the atmosphere. "I can see why you think Dyson might have disappeared in there." I shook my head. "No, something pulled him in. I don't know what it was, but I saw it." My dad rubbed my shoulder and pointed to where the extremity of his beam faded out. "It caved in. Hard to tell with the metal being the same color, but there's a wall of dirt." Dyson couldn't have gone this way. I bumbled at the revelation, searching frantically for an explanation. My dad seemed content with letting me talk, but he wasn't listening anymore. For him, he achieved resolution. He holstered his pistol and began to lead the way back. I followed slowly, numbered by the feelings that I really must have hallucinated the entire thing. Guilt, grief, exhaustion, all of those things conglomerating into a delusion that removed my part of the blame. I don't understand why I would have imagined something so horrendous, and neither did my parents. They didn't want to know where their child came up with such atrocities, as they pandered for an appropriate amount of time before delivering their own explanation, which I was ready to accept as I steadily clambered up the hill, at least until I felt something tug at my jacket. A draft of wind being sucked into the tunnel, trying to take me along with it. Something about that felt wrong, but I was too dejected to investigate. All I knew was the wind didn't blow through a dead space. There was probably another entrance. After we rejoined the modern world at the top of the ravine and shrugged out of our hunting attire, I was ready to focus on something else. I guess that was what my mom was doing. I wanted to find something to occupy myself for the rest of the day, and my dad was happy to oblige. We spent the rest of that day painting the kitchen and living room walls in the light shade of yellow. It fit the home's spacious, contemporary furnishings and warded off the oppressive greenery around us. That night I fell asleep with little trouble. Shadows of the swaying trees above me lulled me into hypnosis again, and I stayed that way until I was on the precipice of slumber. Just as I was ready to pass out once again, the scratching returned. As ever, it was a frantic, pitiful sound. Thin shadows darted across the space between my door and floor, and I watched them passively. Fear mingled with the desire to sleep, and for once I let sleep win me out. The scratching faded with the darkness. Next morning I awoke at 6:32, rather early for me in spite of the past couple days wearing me down. But it felt good to be free of my bed. Got dressed quickly, hearing my parents moving about the halls as well. As I slid a bright green shirt, spouting a logo of some tacky restaurant over my head, memory of the scratching returned. Shuffled over to my door curiously and opened it to check for a detail I hadn't thought of before. Claw marks. Whatever Dyson slid on the wooden floors, my mom would always flip out about the scratches he would leave, but I never saw him inflict too much damage. Just a small graze amid the thousands of our home. The base of my door was scratch-free. However, not a mark where I expected a ton of them to be. I scanned the small lip of wood where the doorframe met the floor and gave it a closer look. I started on the left side and moved right, taking in every inch of the raised wood. Something caught my eye when I got within a couple inches of the right doorframe. It was small and faint, carved into the same sketchy writing as the blood-smeared ball. "We gonna play someday." I shuddered at the childish enthusiasm. It was the type of writing one could expect from an adult talking to a kid or a dog. Condescending and syrupy. I gagged at the thought of whatever killed my dog might have thought it was only playing. Tug of war with its guts? There was no way. No way. My mind reeled at the message, trying to dampen the fear blossoming in my chest. But then a bone-scorching scream from downstairs shot that fear through me like a bolt. I scrambled downstairs in seconds. My father's 2 steps ahead of me. This time, he and I were careful not to jostle one another for fear of another accident as we stumbled into the kitchen. We found my mom standing paralyzed in the kitchen, glass shattered at her feet. She was gaping at our refrigerator. My heart seized in a cold fist as I saw the grisly sight too. A thin line of blood trickled down the sleek metal surface of the fridge, coming from a long, ragged, yellow tail nailed to the fridge door. It looked as if it had been brutally hacked off, with a couple of vertebrae hanging from the thicker end. My dad cursed and swept my mom up in his arms, while I watched on. If this was a game to whoever had done this, was a horrifying sight before me, a twisted variation of Pin the Tail? I didn't want to know, didn't care to. All that I knew was we were being toyed with in a sadistic child's game. And whatever the thing was had invited my parents to play as well.